part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. I am your host, Ben Billman, and it is finally championship week. 1 week leading up to March Madness, when all the conference tournaments are going on, and every team at this point is playing for something. There are teams that know that they are in, that are playing for seeding. There are teams on the bubble that are playing just to get into the tournament, and there are teams that are off the bubble that know they have to win their conference tournaments just to make it to the NCAA tournament. So every game matters, and at some point in the conference tournaments, we do have teams that are meeting for the third time this year, which means that they know each other, know their strategies, and what they're going to do on a possession-to-possession basis. And that makes it very exciting once you break it down and look at these matchups in each individual conference. So on this episode, I am going to do a complete breakdown of the 8 conferences which I think will be the most intriguing during conference tournament championship week, along with 2 conferences that are either done or almost done, and take a closer look at those. So first of all, I'm going to start with the Missouri Valley Conference, which ended this past weekend with Drake beating Indiana State in the conference championship. So Drake earns the automatic bid from the Missouri Valley, and that means that Indiana State is on the bubble. And when I talk about the bubble, I mean last team in, first team out. They are right there. So the problem for Indiana State is that they did not play the toughest schedule, and the teams that they did play, which were tough, they lost fairly convincingly to. On the other hand, they won the regular season crown in the Missouri Valley Conference, and they have close to 30 wins on the season, which is very difficult to do overall. Their net ranking looks very good. They seem to have everything in place other than a high level or high number of quad 1 victories. So the question will be on Selection Sunday, will Indiana State be included based on their regular season conference championship, along with the fact that they have a high number of victories, or will they be left out because they don't have quality victories and the good teams they did play, they lost to? So that is going to be an intriguing storyline as we go through championship week. The other conference to touch on very quickly is the West Coast Conference, and it has worked out perfectly for both St. Mary's and Gonzaga. St. Mary's is the 1 seed, Gonzaga the 2 seed. They play in the conference championship, and at this point, it doesn't matter who wins or loses. I believe they are both getting into the tournament. This would be a quad 1 victory for whoever wins tonight and a quad 1 loss for the loser. So it's going to strengthen the strength of schedule no matter whether they win or lose. I think the biggest thing for this matchup is going to come down to NCAA tournament seeding and how high or how low the committee decides to put them based on the outcome of the championship game tonight. Okay, so I want to run through 8 conferences, and I will list them based on how intriguing and how difficult I think these conferences are going to be in the tournaments, as well as naming a sleeper or a bid stealer in every conference that, as of right now, is not even on the bubble, but I think could still win the tournament and steal a bid away from another at-large team on Selection Sunday. So the first conference that I'm going to start with is the Atlantic 10. Now, the Atlantic 10 is intriguing because the only team that I would say is a lock at this point from the Atlantic 10 is Dayton. But Dayton is the number 3 seed in the conference tournament, which means that the number 1 and 2 seeds more than likely need to win the tournament in order to make it to the NCAAs. The number 1 seed is Richmond, number 2 Loyola Chicago. As I mentioned, Dayton at the 3 seed and UMass at the 4. There are a couple intriguing teams outside of the top 4, including number 5 VCU and number 7 St. Bonaventure, that have a serious chance to make it deep into the field. But at this point, other than Dayton, if a team does not win the conference tournament, they are not getting in. So in my opinion, if I had to pick the championship, what I think the championship game will look like right now, I would pick the number 1 seed Richmond against number 3 Dayton. And I think that the A10 is only a 1-bid league because I think Dayton wins the championship and no other team gets in from the A10. But if there is a team that I do think could be a bid stealer and make the Atlantic 10 a 2-bid league, it would be Richmond, the number 1 team. If Richmond did win the conference tournament, then we would see Richmond and Dayton both make it. But my pick is Dayton in the Atlantic 10. Moving on to the American Athletic Conference. Another conference that has the opportunity for multiple bids. But as of right now, the only team that I feel is a lock to make it to the NCAA tournament is Florida Atlantic, the number 2 seed in this tournament. The number 1 seed is South Florida, and they absolutely ran away with the regular season championship. But the problem with them is that their non-conference schedule was one of the weakest in the conference, and that definitely is going to be held against them on Selection Sunday if they do not win the AAC championship. So South Florida could be a team that wins the regular season, does not win their conference tournament, and does not get in a conference that has a pretty deep standings overall. So the top 4 seeds in the American: number 1 South Florida, number 2 Florida Atlantic, number 3 Charlotte, and number 4 UAB. I think South Florida has seen the end of their run, and they will be eliminated in the semifinals to Alabama Birmingham, the 4 seed. And I think UAB is going to meet Florida Atlantic, who again has already sealed up a bid. And I do think Florida Atlantic takes the conference tournament title, which means, again, that the American Athletic Conference is only a 1-bid league. I don't think South Florida has a strong enough resume to make it, even though they did win the regular season title. If there is a team outside of the top 4 that I could see making a run and stealing a bid, it would be the number 5 seed, Memphis. Memphis started off this season very hot. They went into the conference regular season looking like they were close to a lock to make it to the NCAA tournament. But since then, they have fallen apart. They've gone all the way down to 5th in the conference standings. But if they can get out of the quarterfinal round against either Rice or Wichita State, if they face UAB in the quarters, South Florida in the semis, I could see them reel off a handful of wins, make it all the way to the championship against Florida Atlantic, and win that game. Now, that would be very difficult, but if there is a team that I could see do it, it would be Memphis. But I will stick with Florida Atlantic as my pick to win the American Athletic Conference. Moving on to a little bit bigger of a conference, and if we were looking at the Power 6, this is one of the Power 6, and that is the ACC. The ACC is very top-heavy this year, with only a handful of teams that I believe have any sort of chance at making the NCAA tournament. At this point, I think the locks have to be the number 1 seed North Carolina, the number 2 seed Duke, and the number 6 seed Clemson. A couple teams that are bubble teams that really need to have a good performance in order to advance far and make the NCAA tournament would be number 3 Virginia, number 4 Pittsburgh, and number 5 Wake Forest. Outside of those teams, every other team needs to win the conference tournament to make it to the NCAA tournament. So some of the games to watch. First of all, Wake Forest. They are the number 5 seed. They will play the winner of Notre Dame and Georgia Tech. That is an absolute must-win for them, and I do think they win that game. They then go into a 4-5 matchup against Pittsburgh, and in my opinion, the loser of that game is out, and the winner is squarely on the bubble with an opportunity to make it. On the other side of the bracket, I think Clemson, Virginia in a quarterfinal matchup. I believe Clemson is already in, but if they do beat Virginia in that quarterfinal matchup, Virginia is squarely on the bubble. If Virginia beats Clemson, then I think Virginia is in. That's how close Virginia is, and then again, Pittsburgh and Wake Forest are to being in or out of the tournament. But in my opinion, as this tournament goes on, I think North Carolina and Duke, the number 1 and the number 2 seeds, are the clear favorites. I think they both make it to the championship game, and I think North Carolina comes out on top, and that could put them in position for a number 1 seed in March Madness, with the Tar Heels having swept the Blue Devils on the season 3-0. Now, if there is a sleeper team that as of right now would only get in if they win the ACC tournament, I would have to go with Syracuse. They are the number 7 seed. They have had an up and down season, but it does seem like they're peaking at the right time, right before the ACC tournament. They do have a big quarterfinal game if they can get there against Duke. But if they can somehow beat Duke, I could see them winning a semifinal game against either Virginia or Clemson, and then somehow beating North Carolina in the championship, and Syracuse could be right back in as the auto bid if they did win it. I don't think they will, but that would be my sleeper pick if I had to pick a team that could do that. Okay, moving on to the next conference, and I will go to the Big Ten. The Big Ten is loaded with a lot of solid teams this year. I wouldn't say great outside of Purdue and maybe Illinois. Outside of those two teams, there is a lot of parity, and that should lead to a very exciting and unpredictable Big Ten tournament. Now, it is important to note that this tournament is in Minneapolis for the first time, and so I'm going to go ahead and say right now that my sleeper pick would be the Minnesota Golden Gophers. They are the number 9 seed, and so this will be as close to a home court advantage as you can possibly get. So number 9 Minnesota would be my sleeper pick that currently has no chance to get in if they don't win the tournament. But being so close to home, I could see it happen that they make a run all the way to that automatic bid. Okay, so moving on to the seeding, though. Purdue, again, the number 1 seed. Illinois, the 2 seed. Nebraska, the 3, and Northwestern, the 4. In my opinion, all 4 of those teams are absolute locks to get into the NCAA tournament. Getting that double bye in the Big Ten has been huge, and they are all going to make it and feel comfortable, even if they do lose in the quarterfinals, that they will make it to the NCAA tournament. Below that, Wisconsin at number 5. I think they are safe as well, but they do have to play an extra game to get into the quarterfinals. That extra game will not be against a quality opponent, so a loss could hurt Wisconsin in terms of seeding for the NCAA tournament, but it will not matter as far as getting in or being left out. The most intriguing matchup, number 7 Iowa versus number 10 Ohio State. in the second round. The winner of that would be playing Illinois in the quarterfinals. And in my opinion, the Iowa-Ohio State matchup is basically an elimination game for the NCAA tournament. The loser of that game more than likely is out. The winner more than likely will be in heading into their matchup against Illinois. A win over Illinois for either of those teams would be a lock to get into the NCAA tournament, and a loss to Illinois would put them right on the bubble, depending on how they play against Illinois. Some other teams to keep an eye on are Indiana at number 6 and Michigan State at number 8. Indiana more than likely would have to make it to the championship game in order to make it at least be considered for the NCAA tournament. And Michigan at number 8 plays Minnesota number 9. A loss in that game would be very bad for Michigan State, and that may keep them out of the NCAA tournament if they were to lose to Minnesota. A win over Minnesota and then a loss to Purdue would probably be enough to get them in. So in my opinion, I think it's going to be Michigan State beating Minnesota, but then Purdue beating Michigan State. I think Wisconsin will beat the winner of Rutgers and Maryland, move on to play Northwestern, and I think Northwestern will beat Wisconsin in another quarterfinal. I think Ohio State, who's been one of the hottest teams in the country right now, will beat Iowa. I think that eliminates Iowa from NCAA tournament contention, and Ohio State moves on to play Illinois. And I think Ohio State beats Illinois and locks themselves in by advancing to the semifinals. I think Indiana beats the winner of Penn State-Michigan, advances to the quarterfinals to play Nebraska, where they lose to the Cornhuskers in the quarterfinals. So that sets up semifinals of Purdue versus Northwestern and Ohio State versus Nebraska. And I think Purdue moves on to the championship game and that they will play Ohio State in that championship game. Again, Ohio State being the 10 seed, I think they're going to make a run and make it all the way to the championship game, but that's where they lose to Purdue. And Purdue repeats as Big Ten tournament champions, but that also means that Ohio State will get in and get that extra bid. So if I had to predict from the Big Ten, I think Purdue, Illinois, Nebraska, and Northwestern are in. I think Michigan State, Wisconsin, Ohio State all get in based on their performances in the Big Ten tournament, which leaves the Big Ten with 7 bids in March Madness. So Purdue, with that conference championship victory, will be a number 1 seed and more than likely the number 1 overall seed on Selection Sunday in the NCAA tournament. Okay, so I'm going to take a break and then come back with 4 more conferences, who I think will win those conferences, what that means for the bubble teams, and then also a sleeper team in each of those 4 conferences that is not going to make the tournament unless they win the tournament, but has enough momentum that they could. I will be right back after this.
Hi, everybody. It's John Tellage from the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast. Be sure to hop on with us to follow all the dramatic developments of the reigning American League Central Division champions. From game analysis to interviews to keeping tabs on who could be the next breakout star. We'll have that and much, much more right here. It's the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe here and join the fun.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Welcome back to the second half of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Well, if you missed the first half, I did a quick review of the Missouri Valley Conference and the West Coast Conference and what's going on there. And then I also did a summary of the Atlantic 10, the American, the ACC, and the Big Ten tournaments, who I think will win those tournaments, who I think will get into the NCAA tournament, and a sleeper from each of those conference tournaments that could be a bid stealer on Selection Sunday. For the next conference, I'm going to be looking at the SEC tournament, where Tennessee is the number 1 seed. And just as a primer, if Tennessee wins the SEC tournament, I think it's going to be very difficult to leave them out of the 1 line. I think they're going to be a number 1 seed if they win the SEC regular season tournament or regular season championship and the conference tournament. So at this point, Tennessee at the 1, Kentucky is a 2 seed, Alabama a 3 seed, and Auburn the 4 seed. All those teams are absolute locks to make it to the NCAA tournament, as well as South Carolina, the 5 seed, and Florida, the 6 seed. Below that, I believe every team either has work to do to stay on the bubble or needs to win the conference tournament to get in and get that automatic bid. So first of all, in the 8-9 matchup is LSU versus Mississippi State. LSU absolutely has to win the conference tournament, but Mississippi State, with a win over LSU, more than likely that will be enough to get them into the NCAA tournament. But a quarterfinal win after beating LSU and then beating Tennessee would absolutely lock them in. South Carolina, again, is already in, and I do think they will beat the winner of Vanderbilt, Arkansas, to set up a quarterfinal matchup with Auburn. And going back to Mississippi State, I do think they beat LSU and move to the quarterfinals to play Tennessee. The biggest matchup to watch in the SEC leading up to the quarterfinals is number 7 Texas A&M versus number 10 Ole Miss. I believe that this is an elimination game, and basically the winner of this has a chance to make the tournament, and the loser is absolutely out of contention and is off of the bubble. I will go with Texas A&M in this matchup, which means the Ole Miss is out and Texas A&M moves on to play Kentucky in the quarters. Missouri and Georgia, the 11 versus the 14. I'll go with Georgia, but I think Florida in the next round, no matter who wins, moves on to the quarterfinals to play Alabama. In the quarterfinals, Tennessee is going to take care of Mississippi State. I think it will be a close game, and again, I think Mississippi State gets in as a bubble team because of the win over LSU and because of the close game against Tennessee. South Carolina is going to beat Auburn, and I think that improves South Carolina's seed line where they can move up in the NCAA tournament, and Auburn again will be fine. They are still a lock to make it. I think Kentucky beats Texas A&M. Texas A&M should get in based on that win over Ole Miss, and even a loss to Kentucky will strengthen their quad 1 criteria and strengthen their resume, so they will be fine. And then I think Florida, the 6th seed, beats Alabama and moves on to the semifinals. In the semifinals, number 1 Tennessee versus number 5 South Carolina. Tennessee takes care of South Carolina after beating them last week, and the number 1 seed moves on to the championship. And then Kentucky versus Florida. I think Kentucky is playing the best basketball of anyone in the SEC right now, and I have the Wildcats moving on to the championship. In that final, Tennessee versus Kentucky, Kentucky just beat Tennessee in Knoxville last week, and I think they beat them again. And Kentucky moves into maybe the number 2 seed line by beating Tennessee, and I do think that because of that loss, Tennessee will move to the number 2 line as well. If there is a team that is not in right now, but could potentially make a run and be a bid stealer, I would have to go with Arkansas, the 12 seed. Not necessarily because of what they've done this year, but I put a lot of faith into Eric Musselman, the head coach at Arkansas, and what he's done the past few years. Do they have the talent? Do they have the mindset to make a run? I don't necessarily know, but they have a fairly favorable schedule where they would be playing against Vanderbilt. If they won that, they'd play South Carolina, and then a win over Auburn would get them into the semifinals, and then it would be a crapshoot from there. I wouldn't count it out. Musselman has done crazier things, and the SEC could have an extra team in the tournament if Arkansas were to make a run of that stature. Okay, moving on to the Big East, taking place in Madison Square Garden, one of the most fun tournaments every year because just of the limelight, the exposure, just the feeling that the Big East tournament has every year. The Big East might be the most intriguing tournament because of the amount of bubble teams in this bracket, and I will go through each one and which ones I think get in and which ones get left out. But first of all, the teams that I believe are absolute locks: number 1, Connecticut; number 2, Creighton; and number 3, Marquette. All three of those teams, no matter what happens, I believe will get in. The bubble teams include Seton Hall, the 4 seed, St. John's, the 5 seed, Villanova, the 6 seed, and Providence, the 7 seed. All those teams, depending on their performance in the conference tournament, could get in or could get left out. It's really going to be exciting. So in the first round, Butler plays Xavier. I think Butler takes care of Xavier, moves to the quarterfinals. Providence plays Georgetown, and I think Providence moves on to the quarterfinals. And Villanova beats DePaul, and Villanova moves on to the quarterfinals. And based on those results, that puts Providence and Villanova in a position where they have one more win, and it puts them in a position to go up against one of the top teams in the country in order to be an absolute lock with a win in the quarterfinals. So in the quarterfinals, I have Connecticut beating Butler. And in the 4-5 matchup of Seton Hall and St. John's, again, this is probably one of those games where the winner gets in and the loser is either right on the bubble or just below the bubble. I think St. John's wins that matchup. They do have home court advantage in the sense that they play a lot of their home games at Madison Square Garden, and so I think that will be the key to that win in the quarterfinal over Seton Hall. That will push St. John's into the NCAA tournament, and Seton Hall is going to have to hope and pray on Selection Sunday that they are not left out. I think Creighton beats Providence in the 2 versus 7 matchup, and I think that is enough to leave Providence out of the tournament. A win over Creighton would probably do it, but I don't think they beat Creighton the way they are playing right now. Creighton moves on to the semifinals and eliminates Providence from bubble contention. The same happens with Marquette versus Villanova. I think Marquette wins that game and eliminates Villanova from the bubble as well. So that leaves me with Connecticut versus St. John's and Creighton versus Marquette in the semifinals. Connecticut looks too good right now, and I think they advance over St. John's. But again, St. John's should be safe with that win in the quarterfinals over Seton Hall, and then playing the number 1 team in the Big East. That loss will not hurt them. Connecticut moves on to the championship, and Creighton, the number 2 seed, I believe, will beat Marquette and move on as well. In the championship game, I do think that Connecticut looks too good and is too powerful right now to get beat. I think Connecticut wins over Creighton, secures, again, a number 1 seed, which they will get no matter what happens. but this will put them in line for potentially the number 1 overall seed, depending on how Purdue and Houston do. So in the end, I think the Big East will get Connecticut, Creighton, Marquette, St. John's, and then potentially Seton Hall. So they'll either get 4 or 5 teams into the NCAA tournament. But if there is a team that could be a bid stealer based on not having the greatest regular season, not being on the bubble, but potentially making a run, I'd have to go with the Butler Bulldogs. Thad Matta has done a great job in year 2, getting them to a respectable record and back in the middle of the pack in the Big East. And a big quarterfinal matchup against Connecticut, if they can somehow battle by Connecticut, I could see them breezing through St. John's and potentially winning a big matchup against Creighton would be my pick in the championship, and Butler would be a bid stealer out of the Big East. Okay, moving on to the Mountain West Conference. So the Mountain West Conference is going to be very fascinating because of the amount of quality teams at the top in this conference. It's very possible that if things go the right way, the Mountain West Conference could have 6 teams make it to the NCAA tournament. Right now, at this point, the teams that I think are absolute locks would be number 1, Utah State, number 2, Nevada, number 3, Boise State, number 5, San Diego State, and number 7, Colorado State. The teams on the bubble would be number 4, UNLV, and number 6, New Mexico. UNLV has made a push here in the last few weeks to be the 4 seed. They don't necessarily have the strongest strength of schedule, but they do have an opportunity in this tournament to pick up a few quad 1 wins and maybe sneak back onto the bubble, depending on what they do. So in this tournament, in the first round, Wyoming plays Fresno State in the 8-9 matchup. I will go with Fresno State, but neither of these teams has a chance to make it unless they were able to win the conference championship. Number 7, Colorado State, and number 10, San Jose State. I will go with Colorado State, who is already a lock to make the tournament, and I think this just continues to push their seeding higher. And then in the 6-11 matchup, New Mexico versus Air Force, I will go with New Mexico, and that will put them right on the edge of the first team in, or last team in, first team out discussion on Selection Sunday. A team that has a lot of quality wins, but did not play that strong of a strength of schedule outside of the Mountain West, and that could hurt them on Selection Sunday. Looking at the quarterfinals, I think Utah State, the 1 seed, takes care of Fresno State. I think San Diego State, the 5 seed, takes care of UNLV. And for all intents and purposes, I think UNLV is eliminated from bubble contention. Number 2, Nevada will take down number 7, Colorado State. Colorado State will still be okay getting in. And I think New Mexico, a desperate team who desperately needs a win in order to secure a bid in the NCAA tournament, will take down the 3 seed Boise State. That will lock New Mexico in. Boise State is also safe in that matchup. In the semifinals, Utah State will take down San Diego State and advance to the championship game. And Nevada, who again is one of the most intriguing teams in the country with how well they've been playing recently, beats New Mexico and advances to the Mountain West Conference Championship. In the championship, I have Nevada beating number 1 Utah State. I think Steve Alford and Nevada look like an amazing team right now. They're going to take down Utah State. That won't hurt Utah State as far as seeding, but it will definitely help Nevada in their seeding in March Madness. So in the end, I think Utah State, Nevada, Boise State, San Diego State, Colorado State, and New Mexico all make it to the NCAA tournament. But if there would be a bid stealer out there that is not in, but I think could win, it would have to be UNLV, the 4 seed. They've played well enough against the top teams that they can absolutely do it. And this tournament is in Las Vegas. So again, basically home court advantage in the Mountain West Conference tournament. If UNLV wins the conference tournament, that would be 7 teams in for the Mountain West. But if they don't, I don't see them getting in to the NCAA unless a lot of crazy things happen over the course of championship week in other conferences. And the last conference I want to talk about is the conference that all year has dominated as far as the best teams, the deepest leagues, and going into the conference tournament definitely has the most storylines when it comes to what could happen based on what the rankings are and the shuffling of teams in March Madness. Now, the Big 12, as far as locks for the NCAA tournament, I think it's going to be Houston is definitely a lock. Iowa State, the 2 seed, is also a lock. Baylor, the 3 seed, is a lock. Texas Tech, the 4 seed, is a lock. BYU, the 5 seed, is a lock. Kansas, the 6 seed, is a lock. And Texas, the 7 seed, is a lock. Those are 7 teams as of right now that I believe the Big 12 will have as representation in the NCAA tournament. But there are a couple teams on the bubble that, depending how they do in the conference tournament, could work their way in. And those teams would include number 8, TCU, number 9, Oklahoma, number 10, Kansas State, and number 11, Cincinnati. So let me go through the bracket, and I'll predict who's going to win and what that means for the NCAA tournament bids. First of all, UCF will beat Oklahoma State in the 12-13 matchup. Those 2 teams, though, unless they were to win the conference tournament, other than that, they're not going to get in. And I think Cincinnati, the 11 seed, takes down West Virginia and moves on to the second round. In that second round, BYU will take down UCF and end any chance of UCF making the tournament. I think Oklahoma beats TCU in the 8-9 matchup. Because of that result, I think that locks up a bid for Oklahoma, and more than likely that's going to put TCU in the first 4 out category. TCU has fallen apart over the last couple weeks, and I would be very fearful if they do lose to Oklahoma, which I think they will, that they could be left out of the NCAA tournament. In the 7-10 matchup, I have Texas beating Kansas State. That would eliminate Kansas State from contention. And then I have Kansas beating Cincinnati, and that would remove Cincinnati from contention. In the quarterfinals, I would see a matchup between the 4 and the 5 seed, Texas Tech and BYU. At that point, they would really just be playing for seeding and not necessarily for getting in or out. And I think BYU, the 5 seed, will move on to the semifinals. Houston will take down Oklahoma, and Houston will move on to the semifinals. But because Oklahoma beat TCU, they should be a lock to get in to the NCAA tournament. Iowa State will take down Texas. Texas is a lock, so that's okay, and Iowa State moves on. And then Baylor will beat Kansas to move on to the semifinals as well. So in the semifinals, BYU versus Houston. I think Houston's defense is too tough, and they move on to the championship. And I think Iowa State takes down Baylor. So we have the number 1 versus the number 2 in the championship, and I have Houston winning the Big 12 championship. That, again, along with Connecticut and Purdue, depending on how those teams do, Houston could be the overall number 1 seed on Selection Sunday with their regular season and conference tournament win in the Big 12. So in the end, I think Houston, Iowa State, Baylor, Texas Tech, BYU, Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas all get in for a total of 8 teams getting in from the Big 12. And I think TCU is the one bubble team that gets left out. But if there is a team that I think could come out of nowhere and win the conference tournament that would be a bid stealer, it would have to be Central Florida. Central Florida is the 12 seed, but they have been playing really good basketball all season. They've taken a lot of teams down to the wire at home and on the road, and they have a fairly favorable bracket when you look at it overall, with BYU and Texas Tech in line to get to the semifinals. I think UCF is a team to keep an eye on if they can get by Oklahoma State in that first round and potentially create some chaos in the Big 12 tournament. So that is a lot of information about a lot of conferences, but championship week is an amazing week to pay attention to college basketball. We are only a handful of days away from Selection Sunday, and that's when the real fun begins. I will come back later this week as we get closer to Selection Sunday to look a little bit closer at the bubble teams and where we are in the conference tournament. And then once the bracket has been revealed, I will be recording a podcast going over my picks and who I think will win the NCAA tournament, make the Final Four, all the results, every single game. So stay tuned for that next week. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all another time. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.